the agenda setter.
Welcome, aspirants. Today, we're going to be dissecting the events of December 16th, 2025. Now, these aren't just headlines, right? These are potential questions for your 2026 prelims and mains. So let's jump straight into the analysis that's really going to give you an edge in your preparation. Here's how we're going to tackle things today, and you'll see it's structured just like your GS papers. We'll kick off with the constitutional debates in governance, then shift gears to the economic signals in business. After that, we'll look at some breakthroughs in science and tech, key developments in international relations, and we'll wrap it all up with a look back at modern Indian history. Let's get started. All right, let's get right into it. The big theme today, the Constitution's delicate balance. It's really being tested. And this is the perfect example of why just scanning headlines won't cut it for the UPSC exam. The real trick, the skill you have to master, is connecting what's happening right now to the static parts of your syllabus. That's how you're going to build that deep, analytical understanding that gets you the top marks. So our first section zooms in on General Studies Paper 2. We're going to be looking at a pretty significant clash between two absolute core pillars of our democracy, the executive and the judiciary. The flashpoint for this whole thing is in Kerala, where a constitutional deadlock over appointing university vice-chancellors has just, it's erupted. And look, this isn't just some state-level spat. This is a full-blown governance crisis that's really pushing the limits of institutional authority. The governor has come out and publicly framed this as the judiciary stepping on the executive's toes. He made a very, very strong statement, calling it, and I quote, a direct case of judicial overreach. Now that accusation, it completely sets the stage for a critical debate on the separation of powers. Now this slide is where it gets really interesting for your notes. Just look at how this one single news item connects across your entire syllabus. For GS2, it links straight to the UGC Act of 1956 and the doctrine of separation of powers. But it also forces you to think about the connections, the interplay between federalism, university autonomy, and that really delicate balance between the executive and the judiciary. This is exactly the kind of structured thinking the exam is looking for. So the most important thing here is to get the subtle difference between these two concepts. On one hand, you have judicial activism. That's when the judiciary steps in to protect rights or fill a gap in the law, usually seen as a good thing, upholding the Constitution. But then there's judicial overreach. That's the perception that the judiciary is taking on the job of the legislature or the executive, and in doing so, messing up the balance of power. The governor's whole argument is built on this very distinction. And all of this leads us straight to a very probable mains question for GS2. Critically examine the role of the governor as chancellor of state universities in light of recent judicial interventions. Now, if you get this question, how do you structure your answer? Well, first, you discuss the governor's powers under the UGC Act. Then, you'd analyze why the Supreme Court felt the need to step in. And finally, you'd wrap it up by evaluating the bigger picture, the implications for federalism and the autonomy of our universities. This theme of institutional balance, it goes beyond just the judiciary. Even though the winter session of parliaments is done, the data protection bill is still a huge topic of debate. The core question for GS Paper 2 is this: how do you balance the state's need for surveillance for national security against the right to privacy, which, let's not forget, was affirmed as a fundamental right in the Puttaswamy case? It's a classic dilemma. All right, let's switch gears and move on to our next section, GS Paper 3. We're going to see how the latest economic data could shape what the Reserve Bank of India decides to do next. So the new number for the wholesale price index is out, and it's negative 0.32%. Now, at first glance, negative means deflation, right? But hold on. Here's the real story. Last month, it was way lower, at negative 1.21%. So even though it's still negative, it's moved up quite a bit. What does that tell us? It's a huge signal that behind the scenes, at the producer level, inflationary pressures are starting to bubble up. For your prelims, you absolutely have to know the difference between WPI and CPI. It's fundamental. As you can see here, the Wholesale Price Index, or WPI, tracks inflation at the factory gate, you could say. It's mostly about manufactured goods. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, on the other hand, is about the retail level. It's what you and I actually pay for stuff, and it's dominated by food and services. So WPI is about producer costs, while CPI shows the direct hit to our wallets. This chart makes that upward trend we were just talking about crystal clear. Just look at the jump from October to November.
What's behind this? Well, it's mainly rising wholesale prices of food items, things like vegetables and pulses. It's a sign that pressure is definitely building at the producer end of the chain. So this brings us to a very likely question for GS3. Analyze the significance of rising WPI inflation even while in deflationary territory for India's monetary policy. To score well here, you need to connect those rising producer costs to what might happen with retail inflation, the CPI, down the line. And then, of course, explain how that could influence the RBI's thinking on interest rates. This economic pressure also shines a spotlight on the RBI and its job of managing our currency. With the rupee being a bit weak, the RBI often has to step in. Its main tool, selling US dollars from its reserves. When it does that, it sucks excess rupees out of the market, which helps to stabilize the exchange rate. This whole process is part of what we call a managed float regime, where the central bank intervenes to stop wild swings. And don't forget, all of this is connected to another key concept for GS3, our current account deficit. Okay, on to another really important area of GS Paper 3. Let's talk about a big development in India's strategic space capabilities, and just as importantly, its commercial dreams. For the prelims, this slide is an absolute goldmine. The delayed launch of the Bluebird 6 satellite is just packed with keywords you need to know. First, the launch vehicle, LVM-3. That's ISRO's heavy lift rocket, the big one. Second, who's managing the mission? NSIL, or New Space India Limited. That's ISRO's commercial arm. Third, the key tech on board, the world's largest phased array antenna for something called direct-to-device, or D2D connectivity. And finally, why is it so important strategically? Because it marks a huge milestone in Indo-US space collaboration. 4 keywords: LVM-3, NSIL, D2D, Indo-US cooperation. Make a note of them. So, building on those facts, a potential means question could ask you about the bigger picture. Discuss the significance of India's heavy lift launch capability in the global commercial space market. A great answer would analyze how the proven success of the LVM-3 rocket puts India in a really strong position, a competitive, reliable player for launching those big, heavy satellites for clients all around the world. Now, let's look at a topic that's a fantastic intersection of infrastructure, the environment, and international relations, all of which fall neatly under the GS Paper 3 syllabus. So, India recently hosted a session for the International Organization for Marine Aids to Navigation, or IALA. There are 2 really important takeaways for your notes here. First, the launch of a new portal for lighthouse tourism, and second, a really impressive green milestone. All 193 of our lighthouses are now running completely on solar power. This is a perfect example of how an infrastructure project can directly support our bigger national goals like the blue economy and our renewable energy targets. And finally, let's connect with GS Paper I and reflect on a truly pivotal moment in the history of the Indian subcontinent. Today, we observe Vijay Divas. This timeline quickly recaps the key events of 1971. It all started with the political turmoil in what was then East Pakistan, followed by the rise of the Mukti Bahini leading the liberation movement, and it all culminated in India's decisive military intervention. On December 16, 1971, the Pakistani forces in Dhaka surrendered, which led directly to the creation of Bangladesh. This was a strategic victory that fundamentally redrew the geopolitical map of South Asia. Okay, so what do you do with all of this? Let's boil it down to 3 key action items for your prep. First up, for GS Paper 2, I want you to really dig deep into that clash between the executive and the judiciary. Seriously, analyze it from all angles. Second, for GS Paper 3, it's time for a revision session. Go back to your notes on WPI versus CPI and make sure you're crystal clear on monetary policy transmission. And finally, number 3, also for GS3, jot down those key words we talked about for India's space program. These aren't just random points. These are the high-yield topics you need to focus on right now. And we'll leave you with this, a question that really goes to the heart of our democracy, and it's perfect food for thought for your essay paper. When our great institutions clash, where does the balance of democratic power truly lie? Think about it. We'll see you in the next explainer.